learning classes held in conjunction with Pace University, George Mason University, and the University of Denver. This is just under an hour and a half.
Our guest today, joining us from South Dakota in the city of Sioux Falls, is former Senator George McGovern on behalf of the students at Pace University in New York City and George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, and the University of Denver in the Cable Center. We want to welcome to the class Senator McGovern. Thanks very much for being with us.
It's my pleasure.
Senator, I want to begin by asking you to take us back to 1968, a historic year in American politics for you and the American people. What do you remember about that time in our history?
Well, it was a turbulent period. You know about the assassinations of Martin Luther King, and then just a few weeks later, Robert Kennedy, who was then seeking the Democratic presidential nomination. Before that, Gene McCarthy, the senator from Minnesota, had made a breakthrough as a challenge senator, challenging Lyndon Johnson, who was believed to be unbeatable in 1968, and almost beating him in the New Hampshire primary. And then that led to Johnson announcing he would not seek re-election in 1968. I could scarcely believe that. I had known President Johnson when he was majority leader of the United States Senate. Perhaps more than any other Senate leader, he had a complete command of every senator, what their interests were and how best to appeal to them. And that's why he was able to put through in the 1960s some of the most important legislation of the last 100 years, the civil rights legislation, aid to education, aid to housing, numerous other proposals that went through in terms of domestic legislation. But what forced President Johnson's resignation and was responsible for many of the political upheavals was the war in Vietnam. By 1968, most Americans knew that that war was a disastrous mistake. So that was the background for the turbulence of that period. I came into the picture on the national scene for the first time after Robert Kennedy's death, when his delegates, 143 delegates that he had won, persuaded me to make a brief run for the presidential nomination, even though all the delegates had already been decided. I did that. I came across rather well. And let me just quit on this upbeat note. I don't share the view that the 1960s was a disastrous decade. It was not. It was a decade of great political progress in the country. It was a decade of the emergence of young people in politics on a larger scale, and the emergence of women on a larger scale. And one more thing, the emergence of more people of color on the national stage. So by and large, it was a very productive period in our history.
And yet, Senator, one of the aftermaths of the 1968 convention was the formation of a commission that you co-chaired that ultimately changed the way Democrats select their nominees. Walk us through the process.
Well, the problem that the 1968 convention faced before any reforms were put through was that there were only a few women participating as delegates to that convention where you select the presidential nominee. That decision is the most important decision a political party makes, to select the person who will be their nominee for president and has a 50-50 chance maybe of being the next president of the United States. There were some delegations, state delegations to that national convention in '68 where the women were outnumbered 10-1, notwithstanding the fact that they comprise slightly over half of the population of America. I can think of some states where black people were 10% of the population, or 20% or more, where there wasn't a single black person on the delegation. On some delegations, there wasn't anybody under the age of 30, even though the transcendent issue in '68 was the war in Vietnam, where everybody was under 30. We were saying, in effect, young people are old enough to fight and die, but not enough to vote. So what we did in the 1969 and 70 period, when I was chairman of the Reform Commission, we provided that in the future, those state delegations going to the National Convention had to be reasonably balanced between men and women, reasonable apportionment to black people, to Hispanics, a reasonable apportionment to young people, those 30 and under. That was the most important thing we did, although we did recommend that where states had primaries, that the results be apportioned according to the percentage of the vote that a particular candidate got.
I want to stay in this time period, and then we'll move to the current campaign. And I'm going to turn first to Dr. Chris Malone at Pace University with a question for Senator McGovern.
Senator, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a real honor to have you. When you ran in 1972, that first election where the primary vote really determined the delegate selection, many people have argued that the liberal wing of the Democratic Party was the portion that nominated you, and that's why you tended to lose the 1972 election. Can you talk about that? Is that an accurate assessment? What are your thoughts on that, the delegate selection process through the primary system in 72?
I think it's too narrow an interpretation of what happened. I won the nomination in 1972 pretty much the way John Kennedy had won it 12 years earlier in 1960. I just went into selected primary states and won 11 of them, including the two biggest ones, New York and California. I carried other big states like Massachusetts, Wisconsin, New Jersey, and so on. Anyway, there were 11 of those. We didn't use any tricks or anything like that. We had a good grassroots organization. It reminds me somewhat of the way Barack Obama has proceeded this year in building a grassroots network across the country. And just as he has done, we drew millions of new people into the political process. It's true that the so-called establishment in our party turned against me after I won the nomination and tried to take it away from me. And we had a bitter fight over that at the National Convention, which I finally won. And that's what hurt us. The picture on network television for 3 or 4 days of the Democrats in a knockdown, drag-out fight over who was going to be the nominee, when by any fair test I had won that nomination before the convention even began. So I think that's what hurt us. Let me tell you one other thing that hurt a great deal. In '68, George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, ran as an independent for president. He got over 10 million votes, most at the expense of Richard Nixon. But in '72, Wallace was shot just before the Democratic National Convention. 5 bullets that entered his abdomen, and was unable to move. So he was unable to do what he had done 4 years earlier, run as an independent and pull votes away from Richard Nixon, which he certainly would have done. Absent that shooting, I think I might very well have won the election in '72.
Let me take you back, Senator, and the students to the summer of 1972, July, Miami Beach. And I'm going to share with you just a portion of your acceptance speech, but tell the story about this speech and who heard it at what time, if you would, Senator.
You want me to do that now?
If you would.
Okay. Well, what happened is that the convention got away from us, and the people were making all kinds of motions from the floor on various things, and we frittered away all the prime time on television. I was not introduced by Senator Kennedy to give my acceptance address until 2:30 in the morning. I think just about everybody was asleep except my wife and my children and a few other diehards in the convention hall in Miami. But it was probably the best speech I've ever given, and it's a tragedy that the nation never saw and heard that speech. It hurt us desperately.
Here is one of those moments, July 10th, 1972, Miami Beach, Florida.
This is the time for truth, not falsehood. In a democratic nation, no one likes to say that his inspiration came from secret arrangements behind closed doors. But in a sense, that is how my candidacy began. I am here as your candidate tonight in large part because during 4 administrations of both parties, a terrible war has been charted behind closed doors. I want those doors opened, and I want that war closed. And I make these pledges above all others. The doors of government will be opened, and that war will be closed. Now, truth is a habit of integrity, not a strategy of politics. And if we nurture the habit of truth in this campaign, we will continue to be truthful once we are in the White House.
And Senator, as we hear that, it almost seems as if you're referring to the 2 bookends of that generation, clearly the Vietnam War, and the other part, Watergate.
Yes, I think that's true, and they were tied together. In many respects, the Watergate scenario began when President Nixon set out to find out who was leaking information about the war that he did not want out in the public domain. So he set up the so-called plumbers to wire the phones of prominent members of the National Press Corps, of members of his own White House team, and that was the beginning of a whole series of moves that were illegal, that were unconstitutional, and that came to be known as the Watergate scandals. He even did things like trying to get the CIA to call the FBI and tell them to lay off the investigation of Watergate because it interfered with certain national security measures they were taking. He got hold of the income tax returns from the Federal Internal Revenue Office to punish people who had been critical of him. He had his people break into a psychiatrist's office to get the files on a former Defense Department employee who had released the so-called Pentagon Papers. This was one of many things that President Nixon engineered that began with the Vietnam War and that finally led to his downfall and his expulsion from the president. The only president in American history, going clear back to George Washington, who was expelled from office by action of the Congress, and this in an overwhelming bipartisan manner.
He died 14 years ago, Senator McGovern. When was the last time you talked to Richard Nixon?
Well, I talked to him several times after he left the White House. The first time, I wanted him to join with me in a bipartisan appeal to President Reagan to meet with the Russian leaders. I had read somewhere where President Nixon said no president should ever let a year go by without meeting with the head of the other superpower, the Soviet Union. And so I wanted him to join with me in saying that's a tradition that President Reagan should continue. At that time, President Reagan had been in office for 4 years and had had no meeting with any of the Russian leaders. The last time I saw him was at a reception here in Washington. I take that back. The last time I got seated next to him on an Eastern Airline plane flying from Washington to New York. He had a Secret Service agent with him. I was seated right across the aisle, not by my choice, but by the airline. And he asked if he could come over and sit with me. I had no one with me. I said, of course. So we visited for about an hour. He asked me what I was doing. I said, well, you know, it's a long time since I ran in '72 for president. Do you think I ought to do it again? Well, he said two things. Would you be saying things that no other candidate in your party would be saying? Secondly, if you did say those things, would anybody listen? Well, I thought those were two very good questions. I asked myself those two questions very seriously. Perhaps more than those two questions, though. What decided me not to do it again was that my wife told me she didn't know whether she could stand up under another national campaign, and I would never go against Eleanor on something like that, so I backed away from it.
We now want to go to Steve Klein, professor at George Mason University, with his question. Steve?
Thank you, Steve. I have a question I've always wanted to ask the senator. In 1972, I was a reporter at the South Bend Tribune and covered the football team. Ara Parsegian was the football coach at Notre Dame, and he was a very astute political observer. And it was his theory that the Nixon dirty tricks operation had undermined many of your opponents during the campaign in order to set you up as the candidate that they felt they had the best chance to defeat and thus gain a mandate to further the Vietnam War and bomb Cambodia. I've never had a chance to try that theory out on you. Again, it was Coach Parsegian's idea. What do you make of that?
Before I answer that, I think Coach Parsegian coached at my alma mater, Northwestern, before he went to Notre Dame. Am I right about that?
Oh, you're very right.
Okay, I just wanted to establish that that's my one hook to Parsegian, who was a great coach. Well, I think that was greatly exaggerated. There were a few things done that might possibly have weakened either Senator Humphrey or Senator Muskie. The only one I'm really aware of is the crying incident in New Hampshire, which I didn't think hurt Senator Muskie. You remember that there was a report circulated about his wife telling off-color stories, and when Senator Muskie got up to reply to it, he was right in front of the Manchester Union Leader, a paper that had been very critical of him, and he shed a few tears. I never thought that hurt him at all. There were also a couple of letters, I think, distributed that may have taken a few chips out of Senator Humphrey and Senator Muskie, possibly Senator Jackson of Washington, but I didn't think any of them had any sizable impact on the outcome of the election. And for those who say that those candidates that I defeated would have done better than I would in a general election, I'm not sure that's true. How did I beat them decisively in California, in New York, in Wisconsin, in South Dakota, in Nebraska, in Massachusetts, in New Jersey, New Mexico, all these other states. They had a good test to show what they could do before large voting groups in those primary states. And I won every one of those contests that I've just mentioned. That's how I was nominated. It wasn't because of dirty tricks against Humphrey and Muskie.
Senator, what I'd like to do is to share with you and the students 2 campaign commercials that your campaign put together in 1972 to give them a sense of the issues that you were talking about. And my question as we look at these 2 political spots is whether or not there are any parallels to what you were running against in 1972 and what we're facing today in 2008. So let's watch these 2 campaign ads.
But if you wanted to give one message to the working people, what would it be?
Well, my message to the working people would be to look very carefully at the issues between Nixon and myself in 1972 in the way of jobs, in the way of tax reform, in the way of restoring peace to the world, because those are the issues that are going to decide the future of this country. Where do the 2 candidates stand on environmental issues? Where do they stand on job safety? Where do they stand on health care and education? And if people will look at those problems honestly, I think we're going to win this election in '72.
McGovern, Democrat, for the people. The people are paying for this campaign with their hard-earned dollars. Send what you can to McGovern for President, Washington, D.C.
If our economy depends on a war, we're elected.
I agree. It doesn't, though. We'll do better in peacetime than we will in wartime if we invest the money that we save from the war with some common sense. You'll have more jobs for people. If you invest the money we're now blowing up over there in Vietnam on building the things that we need here at home, it'll actually create more jobs.
And another thing, Senator.
McGovern, Democrat, for the people.
Senator McGovern, parallels to 1972 and 2008, are there any?
I think those were 2 pretty good ads. I wish we'd have had the money to run them more widely. Today, I do think we're having some sideline issues that have very little to do with the kind of president that either Senator Clinton or Senator Obama would make if they were elected. This clatter about what Barack Obama said in Pennsylvania about people in some of the small towns and others in the rural areas are suffering from frustration and resentment, if not bitterness, about their condition they're in. I think that's true. I talk to people all the time who are very anxious, very frustrated, and some of them quite embittered. They don't think that those of us in high office are doing enough to turn the wheels of government in their favor, rather than in the favor of those who least need it, the people at the top. So that kind of frustration and anger is out there, as anybody knows who's walked through the various parts of our country. And I think he was also right in saying it's under those conditions when people in despair about politics tend to rely more heavily on religion. Every clergyman will tell you that when people are in trouble, they're more inclined to move to the church than when everything's going well for them. I think that it's also true that sometimes they turn to secondary issues. I believe in the right to bear arms. So does Barack Obama believe in that. But it's true that that issue is not as important as ending this war in Iraq or straightening out our economy. And so I think there's a much ado about nothing, if I can quote Shakespeare, about this issue that has been made such a fuss over. I had the same thing in '72. I was said to be the 3 A's candidate. The young people in the audience may not know what that stood for. It stood for amnesty, acid, and abortion. I was accused of being the 3A candidate. I'm for abortion, I'm for acid, I'm for amnesty. Now, what are the facts? My position is on amnesty was no amnesty until the war ends. You don't have to go to there if you're willing to go to jail. You don't have to go to Vietnam if you're willing to do what Martin Luther King did and go to jail. But as long as that's the law of the land, you either have to heed it or pay the consequences. I also added that once I were elected, I'd end that war within 60 days, and then I would grant a general amnesty both to those who planned the war and those who protested it. On abortion, my position was so conservative, I'm almost amazed to recite it again. I said that I thought the abortion issue, instead of being decided with an amendment to the Constitution of the United States, should be decided by the individual states. On the question of acid, I got a question about whether I would favor the legalization of drugs, and I said no, not hard drugs, but I would favor changing the penalty for a first possession of marijuana from a felony to a misdemeanor. That had the virtue of keeping our jails and penitentiaries from being filled up with teenagers. All of those are modest, conservative positions, but the Nixon people banged me with that night and day, with the hundreds of millions they had to spend on that campaign.
Well, let me share with you one of the ads, the last point we want to make about this race, and then we're going to open it up to questions on the issue of the military and how the Nixon campaign portrayed the issue back in 1972 with regard to Vietnam and the Pentagon in general. Let's watch.
The McGovern Defense Plan. He would cut the Marines by 1/3, the Air Force by 1/3. He'd cut Navy personnel by 1/4. He would cut interceptor planes by 1/2. The Navy fleet by 1/2. And carriers from 16 to 6. Senator Hubert Humphrey had this to say about the McGovern proposal. It isn't just cutting into the fat. It isn't just cutting into manpower. It's cutting into the very security of this country. President Nixon doesn't believe we should play games with our national security. He believes in a strong America, to negotiate for peace from strength.
And Senator, that was paid for Democrats for Nixon in 1972. Reaction or comment?
Let me just add that all of Nixon's ads were signed off Democrats for Nixon. He'd been using that tagline on his campaign propaganda from the time he first ran for Congress, and then the United States Senate, and then for president. You can always find a few people in the other party that will sign on an ad of that kind. I never proposed cuts of that dimension at all. I never even thought about cuts of that dimension. And Mr. Nixon had to know that. I proposed a series of graduated, modest cuts over a 3-year period with a reevaluation at the end of each year as to whether we could proceed with a cut or whether we needed to level off. You know, that was so urgently needed then. It's just as urgently needed today. Could I say to all of you that today, this year, the federal budget for the military department is $515 billion. That's half of all the controllable annual expenditures in the federal budget. That $515 billion is bigger than the combined military budgets of all the rest of the countries in the world. Think of that. And nobody's threatening us with a war, with a military attack. We have this little band of desert terrorists out in the Arabian desert who've made one attack on the United States, and we want to do everything we can to head off another one. But you know what those men used to take the airplanes that they flew into those buildings? Box cutters. These little $2 a piece plastic box cutters. They used those to force the pilot, the co-pilot, to turn over their airplanes. An aircraft carrier wouldn't do any good there, even though it costs $3 billion. A flamethrower wouldn't do any good. A tank wouldn't do any good. Having 4 or 5 frontline fighter planes wouldn't do any good. We need to have a certain amount of those things, but we've got a vast overkill in our military department. And when I talk about $515 billion, that doesn't count the $150 to $200 billion a year we're spending on the war in Iraq. So what I was saying 35 years ago made sense then, it makes even more sense today.
And again, let me thank you on behalf of the students in Denver and New York and Fairfax, Virginia, Senator. We're going to open it up to their questions and comments. Let's begin with Chris Malone's group at Pace University. Chris?
Thank you, Steve. Our first question is from Alejandro Lopez.
Yes, my question is, how did negative war ads affect your campaign? And what strategies did you use, whether or not did you choose to attack your opponent or did you choose to ignore it? What was the best strategy for you?
I didn't use much of any in the way of negative advertising in my campaign. When I discussed the issues, I told audiences where President Nixon stood on those issues and where I stood, and then I would say the choice is yours. But I didn't go around plastering all the television ads that were used against me, that kind of thing. President Nixon, we were told after the campaign was all over, spent some $300 million in that campaign. That wouldn't surprise Senator Clinton or Senator McCain or Senator Obama today, where they spend maybe $100 million a month. But $300 million was an enormous, unprecedented amount in '92. I spent maybe 10% of that money in winning the nomination, including 11 primaries, and the general election. So I couldn't afford very much in the way of television, even if I'd had the money.
George Mason,
even if I'd had the desire to use it.
George Mason is next. Steve Klein.
Thank you, Steve. Jimmy?
Senator McGovern, thank you again for taking the time to be with us here today. My question kind of plays toward revisionist history. As we all know, Al Gore, Jimmy Carter, there's a laundry list of men who, after their presidential runs or attempted runs, have achieved many great things, many things that have greatly benefited America. My question is, if you had a chance to be president, or you were able to be president in '72, do you feel you could have accomplished more than you have in all your time from then until now?
You know, that's an interesting question. The biggest issue in my life from the first day I entered Congress, way back in 1956, was the problem of hunger, both in this country and in the world around us. And I've been able to do a lot on that issue while I was in office, but I have perhaps been able to do even more in the time since I left the United States Senate. I have teamed up with Senator Dole in a bipartisan alliance to begin pushing for an international school lunch program that would go through the United Nations, with the member states contributing the food or the money, to provide a good, nutritious lunch every day for every hungry school child in the world. That's probably somewhere around 200 to 250 million youngsters. And I intend to keep pushing that as long as I live. I'm 85 now, so one never knows how long their they're going to live, but I'd like to live long enough to be able to say there's not a single hungry child anywhere in the world. That's my goal. I'm not sure I had that big a goal when I was in office, although we certainly transformed nutritional and food situations in the United States. The McGovern Committee report on dietary guidelines for the American people spelled out a formula for a healthy diet for all Americans that's still the landmark that other proposals are weighed against. So I was able to do a lot, and I think while I was in office, I played an absolutely key role in forcing an end to the war in Vietnam. Even though I was defeated in '72, I got almost 30 million votes. That's a lot of people to vote for a candidate who says, elect me and I'll stop this war within 60 days. And I would have done that. But that came during the time I was in office. And since I didn't get to the White House, I went back to the U.S. Senate.
We're going to go to Denver next, and I saw Mark Robinson's hand up, so we'll go to him, and then Mariana if there's another student lined up. Mark, go ahead.
Thanks for being with us. My question was, I see parallels between the way the narrative about you and your military experience. You know, if I'm right, you flew in World War II, but you were still portrayed as weak on defense. Yes, and then John Kerry was in the Navy in Vietnam, yet he was portrayed as weak on defense. So how can a veteran who's a Democrat avoid being similarly blasted by the Republicans?
You can't. Anybody that touches that military budget is going to be hit as weak on national security. Incidentally, I noticed that neither one of the candidates on the Democratic side are proposing taking $1 out of the defense budget. And the reason is contained in your question, that if they did, they'd be branded as weak on defense. I thought as a bomber pilot in World War II with the Distinguished Flying Cross and 35 bombing missions that no one would question my commitment to American security. But they did, as that ad we saw a while ago indicates. I used to offer rather modest proposals on the Senate floor, maybe to cut the defense budget by 1%. One time I offered an amendment for 2%, and they were overwhelmingly defeated. I thought once about offering an amendment to reduce the military budget by $1, but I thought that might trivialize the issue, and I also knew it would be defeated. So I think it's too bad that you can't touch anything in that Pentagon budget without being branded by Republican politicians as weak on national defense. Incidentally, as we saw earlier, even some Democrats are willing to attack you for being weak on defense. It's usually somebody who's never been near a battlefield. They're usually the first ones to say, I'm going to stand firm with the Defense Department for every dollar in that budget. We're not going to yield to the communists. We're not going to yield to the terrorists. I'm going to stand with our boys overseas. Well, of course, they weren't overseas. They were in an air-conditioned Senate chamber in comfortable circumstances, ready to head down to the Senate dining room for a good lunch, but they had already beaten their chests about how they weren't going to permit $1 to be taken from the Defense Department. You know, we used to call the Defense Department the War Department, and some public relations expert got a hold of them and said, look, change the name to the Defense Department. That was done in 1947. People don't like to vote for something that has a label on it for the War Department. They don't like war. But defense, who's going to vote against defense? We're all for defense. So that's the problem we're up against.
We're going to stay in Denver. Mariana, who has the next question?
Thanks, Steve. Angie has the next question.
Yeah, I'm just curious to know that if you were running for president today, how would your campaign strategy differ from what it was when you ran in '72?
I would try to pay more attention right from the beginning until the end to some of the people that I anticipated were hostile or at least mildly opposed to my candidate. I, for example, would go to the president of the AFL-CIO who opposed my candidacy in '72 and say to him, look, Mr. Meany, I know you don't like my position on the Vietnam War. I know you don't like my proposal to divert some of the military spending to other purposes, like the environment, education, healthcare. I know about that, but I want you to know if I'm elected, you'll always be welcome to call me at the White House on anything where you'd like to express your opinion. That doesn't mean I'd always go along with you, but at least you'll have a right to be heard. My door will always be open. I wish I had done that to Mr. Meany. He said in the campaign when they didn't endorse me, as they had all previous Democratic presidential candidates, that he didn't think there was a nickel's worth of difference between Nixon and me. Well, the difference was that I had a record of 90% of support of the issues that affected working people. Nixon was on the other side 90% of the time. So I would try to neutralize some of these centers of opposition more than I did. I also would not underestimate these negative attacks, whether they came in 60-second spots or whether they were in speeches or letters or other vehicles. I would have tried to answer them more directly and more swiftly than I did.
Let's take two questions from Pace University. Chris, it's all yours.
Thank you, Steve. Kimberly Perukal has our next question. Kim?
Yes, thank you so much, Senator, for being with us today. Looking at the role the superdelegates play in the Democratic nomination this year by having the power to possibly overturn the popular vote, today, how do you feel about their power and the way this process works?
I think it's going to be okay. We've talked about the McGovern reforms that were enacted just prior to 1972. And by the way, we've been operating under those reform rules ever since. Even the Republican Party has adopted some of them. The superdelegates were a concession that we made several years later to make sure that a person like the Speaker of the House of Representatives or the majority leader of the Democrats in the Senate, governors, state chairpersons, and so on, that they would be automatically considered delegates to the convention. And that's what most of these superdelegates are that you just referred to. I would hope that a superdelegate would try to follow the wishes of his state as measured by how people voted during the Democratic primaries or the caucuses or whatever the case might be. And if they do that, then it's a good thing to have in the event of a very close contest between Senator Clinton and Senator Obama, that there's a way to settle it in a peaceful, orderly, respectable way. And I think the superdelegates will do that. I would hope they could get together and do that before the convention. I hate to see a big squabble going on the convention floor or in the committee rooms.
Are you a superdelegate?
I'm not a superdelegate. I always try to push things like that to people that don't get much publicity but who work hard as working Democrats. I'd rather see my neighborhood policeman or a school teacher or a fireman or a housewife or a lawyer that doesn't get much recognition. I'd rather see them picked as superdelegates. Plus the fact that our United States Senator should go, our U.S. Congresswoman should go. They ought to be considered superdelegates.
We're going to stay in New York. Another question from the PACE students.
Thank you, Steve. Afia Modest has our next question.
Thank you, Senator, for being with us. My question is, you endorsed Hillary Clinton before you knew Barack Obama, who impressed you as a candidate. If you knew them equally at the time of endorsement, could it have swayed your decision?
Well, that's a good question, because I don't know what I would have done. The fact is that when I endorsed Hillary, if my memory is right, it was last October. What I knew is that she'd been a friend of mine for 35 years, and she and her boyfriend, a young guy by the name of Bill Clinton, worked very hard for me in Texas during my presidential campaign back in '72. So it's natural, I think, that I would turn to Hillary. I hadn't even met Barack Obama at that time, but I want to tell you I've been very impressed with him. I think he's a very capable, thoroughly patriotic, highly intelligent person, and I think either he or Hillary would make a very strong president.
We're going to go back to George Mason. A couple of questions from the students there. Steve Klein.
Thank you, Steve. Isaac?
Senator McGovern, thank you for joining us today. First, I salute you for the progress that you made in getting the voices of women and minorities heard at the Democratic National Convention. My question goes along those lines. In light of the fact that the current Democratic primary is most likely going to be decided at the DNC this year, what do you think about states like Florida and Michigan being able to hold their primaries early and then the voters not really getting a voice in that? Should that happen again in the future, or is that a valid way to do that?
Maybe we need another McGovern commission.
Well, it should not happen again in the future. I think that our national chairman, Mr. Dean, has some good ideas on this. I have a lot of confidence in him, and I think he's going to work out some kind of an arrangement where this can all be decided before our convention. That's one of the reasons I mentioned that option. But we should not permit states just to violate the rules of the party and then expect they're going to be treated just like every other state. What's the point in having rules if a state can defy them and still have full benefits of the vote in conventions?
We'll stay with George Mason. Another question from Fairfax, Virginia.
Thank you. Shannon?
Here's one.
Thank you for being here, Senator McGovern. My question is, earlier in the discussion, you mentioned how Senator Mukasey cried before the New Hampshire primary. And as you know, we had a similar incident happen this year with Hillary Clinton crying. You said you didn't think it hurt him, but apparently people did. And in Clinton's case, people kind of think it helped her. Do you think that's a difference in gender perceptions, or is it a difference in the era, or how do you perceive that?
Let me tell you about Ed Muskie, who was a friend of mine, even though we were opponents for the nomination. We had a pollster, he was a Harvard student by the name of Pat Cadell. Out of our meager budget, we paid him $50 a week. He went on to become a very famous national pollster. But he was running polls every day in New Hampshire. He had his people going up and down the streets and on the telephone. And he told me that right after that crying incident, which the press thought was a devastating blow to Ed, that Ed actually went up 3 or 4 points in the New Hampshire poll. I think that's true. I was up there night and day too, and I sensed a wave of sympathy. You know, I heard people say things like, well, by gad, if that crazy editor attacked my wife, I'd do just like Muskie did, except I'd go in and punch him in the nose. And he said, I don't blame him for shedding a few tears. And I heard that kind of sentiment many times in New Hampshire, so I don't think it hurt him. I think it had a reaction rather similar to the one Hillary received when she genuinely shed some honest-to-goodness tears. People said, God, this woman's not an icicle. She's just like I am. She hurts when things aren't going the way she thinks they should. And I think they reacted the same way on Ed Muskie. It was the national press that decided that hurt him. Otherwise, why could McGovern have possibly come so close in New Hampshire? I came so close because I out-campaigned my rivals.
Steve Klein will stay with your group. Another question?
I have a question about the media coverage of this campaign and recent campaigns this century relative to 1972. How has media coverage changed? What impact has the internet had on campaigning?
Well, the first thing I would say that with all of the new cable channels and the internet and the websites, we've had a quantum change in the coverage of campaigns. There are many more people out there on the trail of these candidates all the time. They can't utter a word anywhere on this planet, it seems like, without somebody picking it up. Many times on camera. I know that the coverage on the campaign of '72 was not nearly that close and that intimate. So in some respects, I suppose you could say if getting all the ideas and information out there is a good thing, we've improved the coverage of campaigns. But I still think the media is concentrating too much attention on these little slips that the candidates might make. If you're going to be out campaigning night and day, month after month, you're going to have a few slips. You're going to be a little impatient some night or a little bit irritable, and you're going to say something the next day you wish you hadn't said. All this clatter about Reverend Wright, I think is a lot of nonsense. You know, I go to church. I happen to be a Methodist. My dad was a clergyman, so I go to church pretty regularly, and I don't always agree with what I hear from the pulpit, but that doesn't mean I quit going to church. It doesn't mean either that I go to the minister and tell him he's off his noggin. I just figure that he's human like the rest of us, that he has moments of passion like the rest of us, and he may or she may say some things that I disagree with, but that doesn't mean I'm going to walk out of the church. So I think all this clatter about what Senator Obama's minister out in Chicago said, and it's just a few little words, a few little sentences taken out of years of preaching in that church, I think that's excessive.
I want to talk
There was too much of that, incidentally, in the debate last night. I thought the one from Pennsylvania between Hillary and Barack. Too much nitpicking.
I want to talk in a moment about running mates, but let's go back to Denver. A couple of questions from the students there. And Mariana, who's next?
Thanks, Steve. Stephanie has the next question.
Hello, Stephanie.
Hi, Senator. My question has to do with the war in Iraq right now. In 1972, you promised the American people that you would withdraw the troops in 60 days. If you were running for president now, would you do the same with the troops in Iraq?
Absolutely. I've written a book with Professor William Polk, one of our leading experts on the Middle East. It's called Out of Iraq, A Practical Plan for Withdrawal Now. When we use the word now, we're talking about a 60-day period when American troops would be withdrawn. But we also recommend the Iraqi government ask its neighboring Muslim and Arab neighbors to each contribute so many peacekeeping men and women to help preserve order there. They wouldn't be people armed with artillery or bombers or anything like that, but people armed with small arms, and they would be given the job of helping the Iraqi government preserve order during this transition period from the American presence to one where the Iraqi government is carrying the load for its own people.
Stephanie, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, I was just wondering if there is any candidate right now that has the same views that you do, if there is somebody that you would pick who would follow that plan.
Well, certainly not Senator McCain, who has been arguing for years we need even more troops in Iraq and might even have to take on Iran. So I rule him out on the McGovern score sheet. But I think that both Hillary and Barack are pretty close to where I'm at. They talk about beginning the withdrawal, I think, in 60 days, and moving to have all of them out of there by this summer. So that's pretty close to the plan that I've recommended.
Senator, I should have asked you this far earlier in our conversation, but can you explain to the students your South Dakota roots and your early entry into American politics?
Well, I was born in South Dakota. At the time I got into politics in 1953, I had just completed graduate school at Northwestern and got my PhD in history at Northwestern in Evanston, Illinois. That was wonderful preparation for politics, but rather quickly I became the executive director of the Democratic Party in South Dakota. I discovered that they all had very little remnants of a party. For example, the state legislature with 110 members had only 2 Democrats. The score was 108 Republicans, 2 Democrats. We had a 2-party system, but that was about the ratio that most South Dakotans thought desirable. So I set out to get slates filled up with good candidates in all of the 60-some counties in South Dakota, and I achieved that. And rather quickly, we elected a considerable number of people to the state legislature, and I got elected to the United States House of Representatives. That was 2.5 years after I began this organizational drive. But I began then, here in South Dakota, what I later did as a presidential contender, and that's to build a good grassroots organization. Many of those people are still toiling away in the Democratic vineyards here in South Dakota.
We're going to stay with the Denver students. Mariana, next question.
Isabel has the next question.
Thank you, Senator. In this campaign cycle, there's been a lot of talk about loyalty, with Governor Richardson's endorsement of Senator Obama, despite his extensive connections to the Clintons. And then your endorsement of Senator Clinton has been painted partially as a result of the Clintons' relationship with you. What role do you think loyalty should play in politics?
I think it should play some role. I'm not going to criticize Governor Richardson. He had his reasons for making the endorsement that he did. This is a very personal matter as well as a public matter, and I don't know all of the things that went into his thinking. I know in my case I attached a rather high importance to loyalty. Here were 2 young people fresh out of Yale Law School who went down to Texas and worked their heads off for me for over a year. I can't forget that. So that's the reason I decided to endorse Hillary, and I do attach a rather large importance to personal loyalty and personal friendship.
And we should probably tell the students that you're coming.
I want to quickly add that I could fully support Senator Obama if he's elected. He's a superb human being and would make a strong president. And in some respects, I think that it isn't just that he comes out of Illinois. I think he has the makings of a young Lincoln. I'd say high things about Senator Clinton, too. We've got two very good candidates here, and that's why they're so close in the voting up until now.
I wanted to explain to the students that you're coming to us from the studios of KELO-TV in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, so it's in the newsroom with people getting ready for the evening newscast. We're going to stay with the students in Denver, and another question, Mariana.
Thank you. Andrew has the next question.
Thank you for being with us, Senator. Given the parallels one can draw between the current nomination process for the Democrats and the 1968 and 1972 brokered conventions that led to, in part at least, led to the Democratic losses for the White House, do you still feel that, given that proportional delegates, the proportional apportionment of delegates in the primaries leads to this kind of almost dead heathen race, which would lead to a brokered convention? Do you still feel that that proportional kind of delegation is appropriate?
Well, it is a fact that if we had the old winner-take-all system, where if a candidate got 51% of the vote and the other candidate got 49, the one with 51 would get all the delegates in that state. That would end the nominating contest faster than it's being resolved this year. But I still think there's something to be said for this proportional system. You know, a lot of people work very hard for both of these candidates in every primary, and I think they're entitled to see some reward for their work, some recognition that their candidate also deserves consideration, although somewhat less than the other candidate. Obviously, the one with the most percentage of the vote is going to have more delegates. But I really believe this proportional division of the Democrat of the vote is a logical one. I wouldn't change it.
We're going to go now to Pace University, and Chris Malone, if there's a follow-up question there.
Thanks, Steve. Jessica Avison has our next question.
Senator McGovern, thank you for joining us today. You were a strong critic of defense spending and opposed to military involvement in Vietnam. In relation to the Vietnam War, you once said, "I'm tired of old men dreaming up wars for young men to fight." How do you feel about the Iraqi conflict, and in your opinion, what parallels do you draw between both in regards to the way the war was implemented and the ethics behind it?
Well, two similarities between Vietnam and Iraq is that neither of those countries was any threat to the United States. We were told that if we didn't win in Vietnam, communism would sweep across Asia, the domino theory. Instead of that, once we got out of Vietnam, got our army out of there, they became our friends. Now they're big traders with the United States. And China, the biggest communist country in the world, now has our most favored nation trading relationship. So there wasn't any big spread of communism across Asia as a result of our defeat in Vietnam. The other thing that's, and the same about Iraq, it was no threat to us. It was said to have weapons of mass destruction. That turned out to be a fiction. Even if they had had a couple of such weapons, they wouldn't have been targeted on us. They'd have been targeted on Iran, which has long been Iraq's central enemy. Those are some of the close parallels. And then the other thing that we need to keep in mind is that in neither of those wars, either in Vietnam or Iraq, had they attacked us or had they done anything against us. So I think this war is a violation, the war in Iraq is a violation of international law. It's a violation of America's standards of decency and honor, and it ought to be shut down as quickly as possible.
We're going to go back to George Mason University for a question. Jeremy, I see your hand up in Denver, so we'll get to you, but I also wanted to ask Mariana if she wanted to line up one of the students auditing the class. one of those students who might remember the 1972 campaign. But let's go back now to Fairfax, Virginia, George Mason, with a question from Steve Klein's group.
Thank you, Steve. Veronica?
You recently spoke about the Nixon administration, how they manipulated your Vietnam message. What messages have obviously been manipulated in this current campaign?
Well, I think I've referred to some of those. I think the role of Reverend Wright has been an issue largely irrelevant, that has been greatly overdone, both by the media and by the campaign. I think this brouhaha about what Senator Barack said in Pennsylvania has been blown up out of all proportion to what happened. This campaign, though, has been largely, I think, a clean, fairly fought campaign. I could think of other things on both sides that I would just as soon hadn't happened. But I think by and large, this has been one of the cleaner presidential nominating campaigns in American history.
Senator McGovern, if you were elected president, did you give any thought to the type of person you would have on the Supreme Court, or some names that these students might be familiar with that would have played a key role in your administration, in a McGovern administration?
Well, I could only say that I would try to get people that are deeply schooled in jurisprudence, that know the law, that know the Constitution, that have had some experience, either as judges or as lawyers who've been through the trial period. One person that fits that goal is former Justice William Brennan, who was named to the court, I believe, by was one of the Republican presidents, I think possibly by Eisenhower. I may be wrong about that. It may have been Bush Sr. I think that on the present court, John Paul Stevens, another Republican appointee to the court, is one that I hold in high regard. His stock went up a great deal for me when the Supreme Court overruled the Florida Supreme Court on the Florida election. The Florida Supreme Court ordered a recount of the votes, and the Supreme Court nationally overrode that on a 5-4 decision. John Paul Stevens said, "We may never know who won the election in Florida, but we know who lost it. It was the United States court." And that raised his stock, in my mind.
We're going to go back to Denver. Jeremy, you have the next question, and then we'll get one of those auditing the class. Jeremy, go ahead.
Okay, well, first of all, my dad's going to be really thrilled that I'm talking to you right now. Anyway, you were asked...
Jeremy, tell the senator who your dad is and why he's going to be thrilled.
Well, he actually teaches here, but he's in the music school, but he was a big supporter of you back in the day, and he talks about you sometimes. So.
Okay, give him my best.
Okay, well. Anyway, you were asked earlier about the parallels between the Iraq War and Vietnam. One difference that I can see sort of in those wars, and I think the lack of the draft plays into this, but one of the differences that I can see is that in the Vietnam War there was quite a bit of protesting throughout the whole course of it, and with Iraq, not so much. You see it at the beginning of the war, and then, at a few anniversaries, and then for the most part, people have been criticizing it, but there hasn't been a lot of public protest. I'm wondering if you have any idea why that might be, given the other parallels between the two wars.
One big difference that may answer your question is that the people being killed are much less in Iraq. We've lost over 4,000 young men, and that's terrible. But in Vietnam, we lost 58,000 young Americans in that war. And it was the constant report of those deaths that I think triggered much of the protest in the Vietnam period. And the other difference is the one that you've mentioned. We had a draft during the Vietnam period so that many young people knew that they could be called next to go over there. And they were in the front ranks in many cases of the protest movement. In this war, we haven't had a draft, so most young people are free of involvement in the war, unless they happen to have been in the National Guard or the Army Reserves, in which case they may have served 1, 2, 3, or 4 tours of duty over there. But even that is still less than the degree of sacrifice in Vietnam.
So Jeremy, what are you going to tell your dad?
Oh, well, basically what you just told me, I guess.
Okay. We're going to go to George Mason for a question there, and then back to Denver. Steve Klein.
Okay, Jackie, thank you.
I was really struck by what you said about proposing to take just $1 from the defense spending. And I really think that supporters of war are usually able to paint a picture that even taking that $1 will deprive a soldier of their ability to withstand an attack. Like it'll be putting American soldiers directly in danger. And I was wondering if you could speak to what you believe would be the immediate effects of a reduction in defense spending. Like, what do you think would really happen?
I think the first problem that you'd have to take care of is offering assistance to people whose jobs were foreclosed in other endeavors. We ought to do that. We ought to treat these defense workers the same way we do other wartime workers. We should try to provide decent jobs, and maybe the savings in the defense budget could be used to cover that need. To get people landed into decent jobs. Maybe some of them would have to be retrained, but temporarily you could use the money cut from the Defense Department to provide these jobs where people could be doing something useful, like working with the environment, working in education, working in healthcare, working in agriculture, working in the national forests and the national parks, so that nobody has to go without a job because of a cutback in military outlays. I think that's very important.
We have just a couple of minutes left. Let me go back to Denver, and Mariana, if one of those auditing the class have a question for Senator George McGovern.
Thanks, Steve. Our auditing student, Ed Halligman, has a question.
Senator McGovern, we're very honored to have you visit our class today. Not only
Thank
because
you.
were a United States Senator and a candidate for the Democratic position of, or candidate for president, but because of your lifetime accomplishments. And I would like to note that I come from the neighboring state of Iowa. I was born and reared in Sioux City and used to participate in debate tournaments in Sioux Falls and Yankton, South Dakota. My question that I have for you, going back to 1964, in the presidential campaign between Barry Goldwater and Lyndon Johnson, Barry Goldwater was the one that was favored increasing our military presence in Vietnam, whereas President Johnson was opposed to that. Why did he later reverse his position, similar to what we have done in the Iraq War, that we became more involved in that particular war?
Why did Barry change his position, or Johnson?
Johnson.
Johnson. You know, Johnson promised in the '64 campaign that he would not expand the war. He said, we're not going north, we're not going south, this is their war, and they're the ones who must win it or lose it. President Kennedy before him had said much the same thing. But once that '64 presidential election was won, overwhelmingly in Johnson's case, he immediately began accelerating the bombing, the troop levels, the military activity on the ground, and the war escalated to the point where by the time President Johnson left office in 1968, he had 550,000 American troops over there. That compares to the 150,000 we now have in Iraq. So I think that he just couldn't see any end to what they were doing that would result in a victory. And as he said privately to a number of people, I don't intend to be the first American president who has lost a war. And he just kept escalating and escalating and escalating until we are up to our eyeballs in the swamps of Vietnam. I'm glad the voters are going to have a chance in 2008 to cast a vote for or against this war we have going in Iraq. There's going to be a clear difference between Senator McCain and either one of the two Democratic candidates that wins the nomination.
Senator, one more historical question, and then I'm going to turn to Chris Malone in New York to conclude our discussion. But in that time period that Ed was talking about in Denver, 1964, and the election of Lyndon Johnson, moving to 1974 with the resignation of Richard Nixon, and then the ultimate pardon by Gerald Ford. I want to take you to September of 1974 as one chapter of the Watergate era came to a conclusion, and ask you to share with the students your thought about the pardon of Richard Nixon in that period in American political history.
Finally, I feel that Richard Nixon and his loved ones have suffered enough and will continue to suffer no matter what I do, no matter what we as a great and good nation can do together to make his goal of peace come true. Now, therefore, I, Gerald R. Ford, President of the United States, pursuant to the pardon power conferred upon me by Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, have granted, and by these presents do grant, a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon for all offenses against the United States which he, Richard Nixon, has committed or may have committed or taken part in during the period from July 20, 1969 through August 9, 1974.
Senator McGovern, your thoughts?
Well, I can understand why President Ford issued that pardon. He was a brand new president that had inherited the White House, and as he himself has said, he knew that if that Watergate issue were permitted to run its course, it might take years. It might take his entire first term in the White House, and the country would be caught up with a Congress that was focusing on this highly explosive issue rather than dealing with the central issues before the country. So he wanted to put that behind him. Most lawyers that I've talked to thought it was premature. They thought that the Senate investigation should have been allowed to complete its course, that there should have been a trial in the Senate over an impeachment resolution by the House of Representatives. That might have taken another year. I don't know how long. But as I say, I'm not a lawyer, and most of my lawyer friends say that that would have been the proper course. So I have a somewhat divided opinion on this. I sympathize with what President Ford was trying to do, but I also have a great respect for the law, and I think many of the lawyers have weighed in against the wisdom of that pardon.
And finally, let's go back to Pace University and Dr. Chris Malone. Chris?
Thanks, Steve. I'm not going to wrap things up. Many of my students here actually have questions. So, Ted Cunhart, why don't you go ahead with the next question?
Thank you, Senator McGovern, for being here. Last night, the Democratic candidates were asked, and I guess they answered with some difficulty, but they were able to do it, about what positive things they would use from George W. Bush's presidency, I guess. And I guess sort of along the same lines, but hopefully not as difficult a question to answer. Do you see any positives in John McCain's campaign or policies, and is there anything that the Democratic candidates can learn from him or his campaign?
Well, he has sometimes done something that requires a measure of political courage. He has voted in the Senate against the wishes of President Bush, his political leader. I haven't memorized all these examples, but I know that there are a half a dozen or so that people in the Senate are aware of, where he's been the lonely Republican voice in differing from the administration on something that he thought was important. So you have to give him some credit for that. I think that Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton have a similar mental bent. I think that they're independent thinkers on the great issues before the country. Neither one of them is going to blindly follow the party line. But you have to give Senator McCain his due on the times he's done that in recent years.
Chris, we'll stay with Pace University. We have about a minute left, so a quick question or comment.
Let's see, who hasn't had a question? Shay, did you have a question, or why don't you use this microphone over here since the middle one isn't working very well?
Very briefly.
Thank you.
Very briefly.
All right.
My question goes back to the Gulf of Tonkin incident escalating into the Vietnam War. What's the correlation, you think, between then and the Bush Doctrine now, and what's your view on the Bush Doctrine now that got passed after 9/11?
Well, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was never intended as a declaration of war. It was triggered by the attack of North Vietnamese PT boats on 2 American destroyers. And so the Senate and the House overwhelmingly, I think all but 2 votes, were in favor of responding to that and giving the President the authority he needed to secure our position there. But we were told at the time by the administration this meant no escalation of the war. And I always thought we were misled on that, because it turned out there was no attack on those 2 American destroyers. I also think the Congress was misled on the Iraqi case, where they were told that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, which he didn't have, and which the international arms inspectors had told us he didn't have. So there was a certain degree of misleading the Congress, the public, and the press on both of those wars.
Senator George McGovern, it goes without saying that the honor has been ours to host you on behalf of the students at George Mason University in Virginia, at Pace University in New York City, and at the University of Denver. And we have a tradition, a round of applause, to thank you for your time and for your insight. Thank you very much, Senator.
Thank you very much.
53 years ago today,